I'm joined first, though, by Andrew Marr, presenter of Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC, as I'm sure you know. Andrew, you and I have sat in this studio and outside Westminster Abbey not that long ago, reporting on the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth,
yes.
the funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, and then the coronation. And I remember you wondering, or the two of us wondering out loud and together about what the reign of Charles would bring. And it has been momentous on a number of fronts, but nothing compares to this day, does it?
I think there's a bit of a parallel with politics here, Sheila. At the time of the election, we thought, here comes a kind of slightly boring, grey, competent Prime Minister. Politics is going to go dull for a while. What are we going to find to talk about? And it hasn't quite proved that way. And I think the same is true of the reign of Charles III. We thought, well, he's not a terribly exciting figure. He doesn't have the historical resonance of his mother, but he'll be quiet, calm, competent, and it has been complete mayhem. This is clearly the biggest crisis the royal family has faced, I think, since the abdication crisis in 1936.
And I suppose on the personal level, focusing in on Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and his relationship to those members of the royal family, again, important to stress, he denies any wrongdoings, the arrest that takes its course and the law takes its course. But that I can't get away from this statement that the King put out earlier on today. You talk about the abdication crisis, and it's fair to say, isn't it, that Edward VIII was frozen out big time along with his wife, really big time along with his wife. That freezing out has been going on for some time, but the statement seems today to be colder than ever, I think.
Absolutely icy, and I have to say, I think rightly so. Charles is doing everything he can. But in the end, you can't distance yourself from your brother too much. You can't completely pretend that he wasn't part of the family. He didn't have the same upbringing. And one of the great ironies of all of this, I think, is that why did he have the job of trade envoy in the first place? Let's ask ourselves that. And I think a big part of the reason is that Andrew, since his involvement in the army and the Falklands campaign, the Royal Air Force, I should say, and the Falklands campaign, hasn't really had much to do, or indeed, by most people's standards, anything to do. And he was a bit of an embarrassment, the heir and the spare and all of that. He's been the spare all his life. And I think there was a sense, give him this job as trade envoy, it'll keep him out of trouble, and therefore be good for the royal family. Well, that's gone well, hasn't it? And we are now in this astonishing situation. I mentioned Edward VIII, but Edward VIII never faced criminal charges. There was no prospect of Edward VIII going to prison for life, which is what the ultimate sentence would be if Andrew was convicted on this particular charge. It's different in that regard. But of course, the abdication crisis was, in the end, all about sex. And this is, I think, Ruth Davidson, we've just been hearing on the news, Gordon Brown are on the same page now. This is ultimately about Andrew's sexual behaviour and the way he was drawn into the Epstein web. It is a bit weird that we're talking about his job as a trade envoy and secrets he passed on to Epstein because of that, because they're absolutely right. That is not really the heart of this.
Again, important to stress, he has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing when it comes to those sexual allegations laid against him. But you are absolutely right to say, and others are right to say, that that has been the story that's been bearing down on the reputation of the royal family because of him.
If he was never inveigled or entangled into the Epstein sex trafficking web, and yes, of course, he says he wasn't and all the rest of it, but if he had never met Epstein under those circumstances, Epstein would have no influence over him whatever. Andrew is one of the very eminent people around Epstein who never needed the money particularly, though he's always wanted money. And so if you take away the sexual allegations, and he would have had no reason whatever to pass anything to Epstein. And therefore, that's why I say you can't disentangle, put a pair of shears between the two sides of this story. So I do think, in the end, the abdication crisis was when the British public looked at the royal family, who they had sanctified for so long, and thought the man, this is a big difference, of course, who was then king, simply didn't have the moral character to carry out that role. And I think clearly people have looked at Andrew and says he does not have the moral character to be part of the royal family. That doesn't mean that the current king is contaminated personally by this. But this sense, all our lives we've been told to look up to the royal family because they were, in a way, the best of us.
An exemplar.
They were the ideal family. They were the good people. And if there were things going wrong in our family, we could look at how the royal family were dealing with the same kind of problems, and so on and so on. But if they are disgraceful, or if some of them are disgraceful, then that whole idea is blown apart.
And
now,
can I come in again on the abdication and Edward VIII? Because I think that you're absolutely right to draw a distinction between the things that were going on at the time, and one facing an arrest and one not, obviously, in those days. But what, from the monarchy's perspective, what had to be done was to distance, almost amputate that person from them. And I think that's what we're witnessing here. Whatever the law finds out, whatever ends up being investigated fully or in part or in whole, that's what we're witnessing from the royal perspective, isn't it? An amputation of him.
I think that's a very good point, Sheila. The monarchy is many things, but it is a ruthless institution in its own interests. And the interests of individual people and relationships matter not at all compared to the monarchy surviving and restoring itself. You saw that with Harry and Meghan, frankly. Never mind Andrew. Some people even say it's a rather inhuman organisation, but it's inhuman in the same way that any big, long-lasting organisation will be ruthless when it has to be. And I think also of the papacy is another good example of that. If you look back at the history of the papacy and some of the ruthless and brutal things
Don't get me started.
have been done to get. No, I won't get you started on that, Sheila. I can see the flash in your eye. I won't go too far down that route.
Oh no, you can. It's just not maybe not today. Not today.
The problem has always been the same, that this is meant to be an almost superhuman, certainly above society institution, and yet it depends entirely on human beings and therefore their foibles and their failures as well as their successes. And
I think it's really interesting that you brought us to that point in the discussion, because my take, for what it's worth, is that the only way it survives now and into the next decades, when William becomes king, if William becomes king, the only way it survives is for all of that above the rest of us nonsense to be thrown out. Now, to be fair to him, he has done a fair bit of that, hasn't he? He's still got the privilege, he's still got the wealth, he's still got the titles, he's going to be the king. But he and his wife have thrown out a bit of that and brought people into the pain and the foibles of their humanity as well, to a degree. And I guess that's a big change. You would never have got that in the 50s, before that in the 30s. No, never.
He's fallen a long way down the slope, Sheila. It reminds me slightly of the Mitford family, which, if you remember, they had a grand country house, and then every few years they moved to another one, and it was always smaller and smaller and smaller. And in a sense, it's been the case with Andrew. He's moved from huge accommodation to smaller accommodation, fewer servants, and he's ended up in a smallish farmhouse. And he may well end up, of course, if this goes badly for him, in a prison cell, which is in itself an absolutely extraordinary thought, given where he started. Imagine being surrounded by all that privilege and adulation all your life and ending up in a prison cell. That would make this one of the most sensational stories in British history, frankly.
And I guess for the king, there is something of a breathing space, because the law is the law and it must be given the space to operate properly and all of the rest of it. But I'll go back to where you began, which is that the sexual allegations against him, and even just the sexual stories around him in relation to Virginia Giuffre and others on Epstein Island, they are far from concluded from the royal family's perspective, are they?
I think we both know, because we're both old hacks, that we are at the beginning of the story, not the end of it at this stage. There's a long, long way to go yet. People who say this is the end of the royal family, I think are half right, in the sense that the danger for the royal family is not some kind of revolution or upsurge from below and being kicked physically out of their palaces and the rest of it. The danger is a weary sense of boredom, mild disgust, disbelief spreading through the population. We just don't want to hear about them. At the time when most British people don't care about royal stories, don't want to hear about the royal family, then the palaces may be there, the titles may be there, but in its essence, the monarchy is over. And I think that's the real danger for the king now, that we shrug, we move on. Of course, the news cycle is very fast these days, and there's always another story, there's always another scandal to talk about. But actually, up and down the country, normal, ordinary people who once would have had flags out of their houses when the Queen was in the area and would regard themselves as loyalists, loyal monarchists, really can't be bothered anymore. That's the danger.
It is, without a doubt, a danger, and it's a danger it's faced before, and worse, arguably, I suppose, because people often look back further than Edward VIII. They look back to George V and say, he is the one who understood that to survive, people had to be interested in them and want to see them and want to read about them and hear about them. And therefore, they had to be visible, they had to be up close, they had to be in your face, they had to be meeting and greeting you, going to your workplace, going to where you are. That's, in a sense, where the modern Windsor family began, isn't it?
Quite right. And to use sort of antiquated, old-fashioned language, he realised they had to be a bourgeois family or a middle-class family. They had to look and sound like well-off middle-class British people everywhere. And that, of course, I've mentioned Edward VIII. What about Edward VII? Had the British public known what he was up to in the bedroom and indeed in carriages and in various rooms around Europe, then he would have been in the same sort of status as Andrew is today. I mean, he was an absolute old roue, but those days, of course, we didn't know about it.
You chose a beautiful word there. I kept thinking of a word, realising I couldn't say it on national radio, so thank you.
I think roue is safe enough.
Thank you for coming up with roue. It's a much more polite way of saying really some awful things, but thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Always good to talk to you. Andrew Marr, presenter of Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC, Mondays to Thursdays, of course, from 6 o'clock.